Bible, 1 Corinthians.
We're picking up in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and it's talking here. He starts out in verse 1. Now, concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. And what he's talking about here is there was a lot of meat that would be sold in the market that had been sacrificed to idols. They're in a very pagan city, a city that wasn't really concerned about the things of God in general. And so a lot of the things that were sold were things that were already been used in idols' temples or sold or sacrificed to idols. And he said, early, to him, it really didn't matter, sacrifice to idols or not. It really wasn't a thing. You're going to sanctify the thing by prayer. But, knowledge, the knowledge of that's okay, actually can make somebody arrogant. And he said, love edifies. And so he goes through this chapter, and what he tries to do is say, you have liberty to do that, but don't do it if it offends your brother. Don't take your liberty that you have. In verse 10 it says, for if someone sees you who have knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? Even though his conscience is weak and he really is not sure if he should be doing this, if he sees you doing it, he may do it, and then he's condemning himself because he's done it. And so he says in verse 11, for through your knowledge he who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake Christ died. Thus, by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. And he sums up verse 13. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, and I will not cause my brother to stumble. He's saying it's better not to do something that you know is going to cause someone in the faith to stumble. Even if you know it's okay for you, your conscience is clear in it. He says, if you know that it's going to make someone else stumble, he said, don't do it. We're to live like Christ. We're not just to live for ourselves. We're to do that which is edifying to our brothers and sisters, which doesn't cause them to stumble. And so sometimes that's going to mean sacrificing some things that we do. And it's interesting, if you're in leadership in the church, you're under a stricter judgment. People are going to look at you in a stricter way. You really need to hold fast a higher standard. What others can do, sometimes you can't, because they'll do it and they'll say, well, I'm free to do that. I know my conscience is free to do that. You can't do it because you're overseeing or you're responsible for a lot of people. And some of those people may have a weak conscience regarding eating meat. Maybe they're vegetarians and they think that's what the Lord wants. And if you know that, then you don't go ahead and just do what's offensive in front of them, but for their conscience sake, don't do it. Don't do it. You say, well, I got a right to do it. Well, yeah, you do. But we're living in a higher standard, and we're living a standard which was living not just for ourselves, to edify ourselves, but to edify others also. So, chapter 9, taking care of those who minister among you. Interesting to me, in verse 2, it says, if to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. So, Paul's apostleship apparently was questioned by some people. I think apparently some even in Corinth. And he said, if I'm not an apostle to some, I am an apostle to you. And it seems like this apostleship was basically being a father in the faith. It was a relationship that he was talking about here. And skipping on here, we're going to skip quite a ways into verse 24. He talked in this about how you should take care of those who labor among you. Do not muzzle the ox. That wasn't just said for the ox's sake. That was talking about a principle. If there's people laboring among you, you should help them. Now, Paul tried to go out of his way not to require anything from the people he was ministering to. In fact, he made tents along with some others that traveled in those days in the church, so that he could make a living and not require those that he was ministering to give him something. But he's saying you should do that, though. You should give to them. You should take care of them, and so that they can give themselves fully to what they're doing in ministry. And so in verse 24, he says, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. And everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They do it to gain to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. I buffet my body and make it my slave, lest possibly after I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. So he ends this whole thing in talking about our responsibility and he says, I run in a race, all run in a race, but we should run in a way that we're going to win. Well, can only one of us win? We got 2 people in this room right now. Is only one of us going to win? But, I think all of us can compete in such a way that we win. Who wins the race in the Christian world is the body of Christ. It's Christ in the body and all that are in that, all that are in that body. But he's talking about here how to discipline ourselves that we don't fall astray, that we don't get caught in the things of this world. He says, the way I do that, I discipline my body. It says, I run the race in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way. I buffet my body and make it my slave, lest possibly after I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. What a statement for him to make here. Some would argue that, he can't do that. But Paul's warning against his own weakness that he could have. And so he brings his body under submission. He makes it his slave so that he's controlling what he does with his body rather than his body controlling what it does with him. So rather than the body being in control of him, he's in control of his body. And he does it so that he doesn't end up in wayward activities and doing things that are going to disqualify him from the kingdom. Chapter 10 uses Israel as a warning, their example in the past. They were delivered from Egypt, but then they fell because of unbelief and immorality. They were taken out and taken through the wilderness, and we're supposed to learn from their mistakes. It says, verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Then he says, no temptation has overtaken you, but as such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, that you may be able to endure it. So he's talking about here, we need to learn from what Israel's mistakes were and what they did in the wilderness. A lot of them were delivered out of the wilderness, but then they tried the Lord, they grumbled and they groaned, and they had these things happen to them and are written for our example, that we can learn, us upon whom the ends of the age have come. I think we're definitely even closer to the ends of the age than Paul was in the writing of this. And he's just saying, we've got to watch ourselves. He says, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Then he describes there's no temptation that's overtaken you except just common ones. And in that temptation, God has given us a way to endure it. And so we need to look to him in the midst of whatever situation we're in, and we can get through it. Verse 23, once again, it's this thing about living in a good conscience before your brothers and sisters, and you don't live your life just alone, but you live them with your brothers and sisters in mind. I'm going to go back a little bit here. He's talking a little bit about when they're taking the communion. It says, in their midst, there's some problems they've been experiencing. It says, is not the cup of blessing which we bless a sharing of the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break a sharing of the body of Christ? Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Look at the nation of Israel, are not those who eat the sacrifice sharers in the altar. He's talking about, let's not be doing things that are contrary to the nature of Christ. If you go to a temple and participate in what they're doing and then call yourselves a Christian, there's a compromise that's going on there. He says in verse 23, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. It says, for the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. If one of the unbelievers invites you and you wish to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone should say to you, this meat is sacrificed to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. So he's just saying, you could go and you can eat those things, and when you go before an unbeliever, eat whatever's set before you. But if they say, wasn't that sacrificed to idols? He says, don't eat it for conscience sake. Not your conscience, but theirs. Because they're thinking that you're doing something in violation. So he says, we don't just live to edify ourselves, but we live to edify our neighbor also.